South Africa woke up to the surprising news of Oscar Pistorius being kept behind bars until further notice. Pistorius was expected to be released from prison last Friday after serving just 10 months of his 5-year sentence. This after Minister Masuta said that the parole board had to sit down and redress Oscar Pistorius' parole situation. However, the state has since launched its appeal against Oscar Pistorius, saying that he needs to serve more than 5 years in prison or a life sentence. The ANC Women's League also launched their petition to the Minister of Justice, arguing the fact that it would be such an insult for Oscar Pistorius to be released out of prison, especially in this month of August, which is the Women's Month celebration in South Africa.
No, I just think it's right what they did by not letting him out, because just because he's a big celebrity and everything, he still murdered someone. So I don't think it's fair that he gets to get shorter time just because he's well known around the world and whatever. And like my friend said, if it was somebody that I knew personally, I'd be very hurt if like they got away with it so easily. And like especially because we're celebrating women this month and stuff, it's unfair and it makes it seem like we're not as important, because you can murder someone, and even though she's just as well known as him for being a model and stuff, then she's like, it doesn't mean as much and he gets away with it.
I think it was really unfair for him not to be released, because he had served his time. I feel like if the law states that you're supposed to be released at a certain time, it should be fine for you to get out at that time. But then it's like the law didn't follow its own rules. It's like the law did it out of the public's interest. It didn't do it out of what it had said it would do. So I don't think it was fair for him to stay there for long.
I think what they did, the parole, with not releasing Oscar on last week Friday, was correct, because it is Women's Month firstly, so he killed his girlfriend who was innocent, she didn't do anything, and releasing him just because he's famous and the story is going around the whole world is not fair. And it's right for the ANC Women's League to put their foot down and to make a stand in this country and to stand for the women in South Africa.
I really think that's really unfair, because it shouldn't. It has now become a political thing. It's no longer a judiciary thing. It's too much of politics now. I don't think it was fair for him. He should have gotten out at that time, because that's what they told everyone when he was being sentenced. I feel like I don't think it's okay. Yeah, I don't think it's fair too. I don't think it's fair, because if they wanted to give him a longer sentence, they should have given him a longer sentence from the beginning of everything, not towards the end. So I don't feel like the state appeal really applies right now. The appeal might be valid, but I don't feel it's valid enough for it to come right now at the end when he's already served his time in jail, because I think he's going to serve house arrest after that, which I don't think it's really fair.
Okay, I think the ruling was quite fair that he wasn't allowed parole, especially considering it was such a short time that he has served so far. And yes, especially in terms of Women's Month, I think it would have been a little unfair to allow him that access. And I think the ruling's fair and just, and he must serve his time, because what he did wasn't right. Just because he is a celebrity, he shouldn't be given preferential treatment. I think under the eye of the law, we should all be treated fairly, and I think this is fair. I think I definitely think what he's done is correct and it's appropriate.
In terms of parole, what normally happens is you'll serve a third of your sentence, like you're eligible for parole if you've served a third of your sentence. In Oscar Pistorius' case, right now, specifically like in the last week, I think, is when he's been eligible for parole, but he applied for parole a lot earlier than what he was eligible for, if that makes sense. So in terms of like, if it's fair or if it's not fair, looking at it from the parole perspective, it is fair that he's been denied to some extent, because he needs to apply now. But with the prison overcrowding situation, like, why not start the process early if you are going to be eligible in the end anyway? So for them to turn around and be like, yes, you can get parole, and you're like when he was first sentenced, and now suddenly turn around and be like, no, it's not very fair on him either. Like, either just tell him from the beginning, no, you're never going to get parole, or yes, like there is a chance. So now he has to start the whole process all over again. Apparently, that's what the story is. In terms of the Women Month though, I think that right now it would be very a huge media uproar if he was released right now, and I think that that's unfair as well because of what he did do to Riva. Yeah.
The state has lodged its appeal in the Oscar Pistorius case, arguing that the court incorrectly applied the principle of dolus eventualis. Pistorius shot and killed his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp on Valentine's Day 2 years ago, claiming he thought she was an intruder. The state's legal team has referred to the accepted facts in the case against Pistorius in that he deliberately fired shots at the door behind which Steenkamp was standing. It argues that if the court considers that Pistorius armed himself with the intention to shoot while knowing there was a person behind the door and intentionally fired 4 shots, the only conclusion is that he intended to kill the person in the cubicle. The state says it makes no difference that the athlete thought the person behind the door was an intruder when he opened fire with the intent to kill. Pistorius' legal team has just 1 month to file its responding papers. The matter is expected to be heard in November. Meanwhile, a panel of 3 judges will now be tasked with deciding whether the decision to grant Oscar Pistorius parole was legitimate. Justice Minister Michael Masuta announced on Wednesday last week that he had referred the decision to a review board after legal advice suggested the athlete's parole was granted prematurely. Pistorius is serving a 5-year sentence for shooting and killing his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp on Valentine's Day 2 years ago and was scheduled to be released under correctional supervision last Friday. Masuta said he's referred the parole board's decision to the National Council of Corrections for review. In terms of the act, you must have served at least 1/6 of your sentence. When the board sat and considered his application for parole, he had not yet completed the 1/6. So what is parole? What actually is parole?
Okay. In short, parole is the conditional release of an offender who is serving his sentence in a correctional facility. The idea of releasing him prior to the expiry of his court-sanctioned sentence is that he should be prepared for reintegration back into the community from whence he was taken from when he was put into prison. So with parole, you set certain conditions upon the release of this individual. But of course, in itself, it is a process. And it also depends on, if we ask who can be paroled, it depends on the sentence that the individual has received. It depends on which section of the Criminal Procedure Act the presiding officer or the magistrate or the judge has sentenced the individual. So for example, you'll find that for some, they can be sentenced, let me just read this here, and this would apply to Oscar just as an example. Section 276(1), subsection 1 of the Criminal Procedure Act, 1/6 of sentence must be served prior to placement under correctional supervision by the commissioner, and sentence may not exceed 5 years. Right. Then you have others where section 276(1) of the same act, normal term of imprisonment, which may be referred to the quota quo, which is the court that sentenced the individual upon completion of 1/4 of sentence for possible conversion of sentence in terms of that section. The portion of sentence left to be served may not exceed 5 years. So the answer to that is it depends on when is a person due to be paroled. Certainly for some, depending again on the section of the Criminal Procedure Act that you were sentenced under, can be a 1/6, can be a 1/4, can be half, or for some even can be 3/4. You must have served 3/4 before you are considered for parole. But the underlying idea of parole is that it is not a privilege it is a privilege, right? It is not a right. Okay. Yes, it is not a right. Whereas although in some countries it is a procedural right, that it is expected that once you've served a particular portion of your sentence, whatever again section you were sentenced under, it automatically kicks in. It's almost an automatic process. We don't quite have it yet here as an automatic process. But we are going in that direction where it will become a procedure right, in as much as the right to remain silent, the right to a fair trial, right, those are procedural rights, which you and I don't ordinarily exercise because we don't break or offend the law. So I think in the direction we're heading here in South Africa, it will become a procedural right, but currently it's deemed as a privilege. There's no right to parole. But it does serve its purposes, certainly the reintegration part, where you need to prepare offenders to be reintegrated back into society. And if they serve that minimum part that the court had sanctioned, usually that's where the process begins.
Now, the alleged Minister Masutha's interference in the Oscar Pistorius case, is that justifiable?
Well, the minister himself acknowledges that the basis upon which his involvement in this Oscar Parole issue came about was legally baseless, in the sense that it was the ANC Women's League that brought the petition, right, to suspend Oscar's release on parole because it's Women's Month. Right. The minister acknowledged in law there's no basis that he can interfere there. However, he took it a step further and decided, but were procedures followed? Now, is he interfering? There are two ways to answer that. It's a yes and it's a no. The no, from the perspective that yes, the Department of Justice and Correctional Services are his responsibility, and it is up to him to ensure. I mean, he is the person who takes full responsibility for any issues that do take part in that particular department. So from one perspective, he's ensuring that the law was followed to the letter. Although some would ask, does he do this for every single inmate, every single offender who is about to be released on parole? Is this an established practice, right? Or is this particular to Oscar? And therefore, maybe the issues of the ANC Women's League now come into play, which legally they don't have any legal standing to make use of that. So that's the no, with a proviso that hopefully this is established practice, right? Not only by the minister, but anyone that he delegates. The yes part is interfering. Generally, when it comes to issues of parole and consideration of parole, even medical parole, depending on the length of sentence that you are serving, technically those who are serving a sentence of less than 24 months, it is up to the discretion, or at least the duty of the commissioner of that particular prison who makes that consideration for you. People serving 24 months and above, that is the Parole Board and the Correctional Services Parole and Advisory Board. It's their mandate. When it comes to people serving life, this is where the minister comes in. Right. So hence, for example, he was very much heavily involved in the medical parole applications of Clive W. Lewis and so on and so forth, because those are people serving life sentences. That's where his jurisdiction comes in. In this particular case, unless the Correctional Services Act says anything different, I would say yes, he probably would be interfering in this particular case here.
Okay, so in your opinion, now that we've established that he is actually interfering, in your own opinion, what do you think is most likely going to happen to Oscar?
Well, look, the basis upon the interference, it depends on how somebody interprets the law here. And let me read what the law says in this particular case. It says, and this is the Correctional Services Act, a person sentenced to incarceration under Section 276(1)(1 in the Criminal Procedure Act must serve at least 1/6 of his or her sentence before being considered for placement under correctional supervision, unless the court directs otherwise. So what this entails, and he is interpreting this quite literally, right, that first serve your minimum sentence before you are considered for parole. So in other words, first serve your 10 months, then only can the parole board sit and consider your case. Whereas the parole board looked at this a bit more constructively, right, a bit more progressively, and said, we won't wait for you to serve 10 months, but we'll ensure that by the time you reach 10 months, you are ready for release on parole, reintegrated back into the community. So this is where the clash comes in now. Who is right? The parole board? And again, it all will stem down to what has been the standard practice of parole boards across the country, or even specifically to this parole board under Gauteng here, where he's currently housed. Is this the standard practice, the established practice of before the minimum sentence period has come, have they been considering parole, and when the sentence, or at least the part of the sentence has been served, then the person is released? If it's established practice, that is now a custom. That is essentially part of the law now, right? That should, and it's simply interpreting a law that exists, but in a progressive manner. The minister in this case has interpreted the law very rigidly and literally, that first serve your portion and then be considered. This is where the clash comes in. Who is right and who is wrong? If the parole board have been doing this all along, it's established practice, then the minister is wrong. If not, then the minister is right.
Will it be assisting women and children abuse across the whole of South Africa?
Trust on it. There's various And we have to do something about it. We can't just see something terrible and walk away. We have to do something. Even if you personally can save one person, and if I can save one person, then I will be happy.
We're very excited. The court actually agreed with the NPA, agreed with our prayers as the respondent that this is functions official, it's unprecedented, there's no precedent for this. It's going to open a floodgate of all these kind of appeals to go back to the court accord. At this stage, I cannot comment as to what the state of the correctional supervision is, as you are aware that Mr. Pistorius will maybe be due for his release in months to come.
Do you feel that this whole Oscar Pistorius case has really put South Africa's justice system under pressure? It's like the whole world is looking to see what eventually is going to end up as the conclusion of the Oscar Pistorius case.
Yes, I think many people, and particularly the Steenkamp family, and indeed the Pistorius family, would want to see an end to this drama, and end to this episode. Certainly, we have put ourselves on the map, and albeit for the wrong reasons. Because also bear in mind, even if he comes out when this whole parole debacle is over, he still has an appeal waiting for him, right? And an appeal against the 5-year sentence he received, an appeal against the conviction that he was convicted under culpable homicide and not under murder/dolus eventualis. So yes, certainly, again, it just puts us in the spotlight for good reasons, right? We still have a system that works, but now obviously certain questions start to be asked. What is this fascination with Oscar here, right? And what is the involvement of the ANC Women's League? Granted, it is Women's Month, right? But Women's Month, remember, what was the political event that led to this particular holiday of Women's Day, and therefore the month of celebrating women's contribution to democracy, women's contribution to society and communities at large. At the time, while we're not disputing issues of domestic violence and abuse of children, women and children exist, that is not the context of Women's Month, right? Certainly. So for the wrong reasons, yet again, we find ourselves in the spotlight and regarding Oscar. And quite frankly, yeah, we need to see an end to the story, because part of that reintegration process is that a person is forgiven. And this is what parole is really all about. Ensuring, right, that firstly we're releasing the right people, right, back into the community. We are reintegrating them, right, which is again part of the criminal justice system, and accepting people make mistakes and people can reform, right. Now, with Oscar, there's still a long road ahead. Again, just simply because of this appeal. It's going to be many more months, media, cameras, and a possibility of going back in again. Yes, that possibility exists. Yeah.
Now, in conclusion, Oscar Pistorius has done what he's done. He is going through what he's going through. As a criminology expert, is he ever going to be able to restore himself to be the star that we once knew him to be after all this?
You see, that's going to be very difficult for him, very, very difficult. If you consider his lifestyle, and we're not talking about lifestyle in terms of the luxuries that he had, right? Yeah, no, not so much, but him as a person, who he was, what he was. He was an athlete who beat the odds, managed to compete against the best, you know, at World Olympics and so on and so forth. Sponsorships were very much part of his life. His life will never be the same after all this. He will not be the same Oscar. And again, there will be quite a lot of focus on him, even if he is released. Again, you saw what happened with Shabir Sheikh when he was released some years ago. The media followed him wherever he was. So not only will he be under correctional supervision, right, but also the public, right, under public scrutiny. And we need to learn to be a forgiving society. This is something that we lack as a society here in South Africa. We tend to want to remind people that we are wrongdoers, we are offenders, as if to say we're not capable of change, right? Which is what parole, and which is what, hence it's called the Department of Corrections, right? It defeats the purpose to continue punishing someone who's already gone through punishment. And we as a society do not actually realize the role we play in people's reoffending, right? With people going back into prison, that we don't accept what they did was wrong, and we don't accept that they've changed. and back inside they go. That's hence the terminology of the revolving door in prisons. We call it recidivism, the rates of which people reoffend and return to prison after being released. Recidivism rates in South Africa are above 80%. In other words, more than 80% of offenders who are released either on parole or have finished serving their sentence find themselves back in our prisons.